weapon will prosper. No enemy triumph. He will not overcome. He can't scale these walls. Injustice will not win. Hell's gates will not prevail. Not on my time. Not on my watch. I am a watchman, and I take my place. As I wait, I will keep the faith. 'Cause I am a watchman, and I stand my ground. But if I never see it, I will stay the course. I will run the race, I will fight the fight, and I will keep the faith. I keep my eyes fixed on you.
All right, welcome everyone. Zachar Skadden coming to you live from North Carolina in my makeshift studio today as Pastor Tim is literally in the air right now on his way back from Columbia. And I have Randy Grigsby in the background joining us to discuss the fruits of Christian nationalism. And before we get into that, I want to go over a few just points of news that have happened in the recent hours. Early this morning, you probably saw the supreme leader of Iran, um, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you view it, died in a helicopter crash. And for those in Iran, some particular situations have arisen. And so we want to pay attention to that. We're not going to discuss that today a little altogether. But for those of you who have joined in here on YouTube and Rumble, thank you for joining in. And if you want to share, if on YouTube or Rumble, with those of you know who have watched or want to watch this in our noon prayers, the reason we're only on YouTube and Rumble on our Pipeline Report channels is because it's a very sensitive subject. And for whatever reason, YouTube, Facebook just love to knock down Randy Grigsby whenever he speaks. So we have decided to protect ourselves and staying only on the Pipeline Report channel so that we can have this conversation and not have it be censored, not have to worry about it being censored. Now, with that being said, we want to look at a somewhat of a compare and contrast of what has now become popular, the term of Christian nationalism. We'll be working around a certain definition that I'll get into here in a second. And then we want to discuss what are the fruits of it. And we want to look at the particular example, as our resident historian here, Randy Grigsby, knows a lot about Nazi Germany and how they walked out their nationalistic identity and how Christianity was used in and of its sense. This is a modern term, so you're not going to find it, and we were not able to find it. We were just discussing that before. The term Christian national was used by Germans themselves, but the way it's being defined and the way the working definition that we'll work off of, it will apply, and other nations will apply as well. We could go through a history of nations, whether it be Britain or Russia, who consider themselves Christians and then have it be distorted, whether it be through a monarchy or government, three branches of government within and of itself with a constitution and everything. But we're going to stick with Germany. And then we hopefully can at least get to the point of understanding, one, whether we want to accept or deny the term, being labeled the term Christian nationalist, and then what we should be looking for to input in its place. Because when we pluck up, we want to replant something in its place. There's we find in Jeremiah. And so we're not going to be able to get into the full details of that in its entirety. We'll have to have other shows for that. But that's where we're going to start those 3 points. What is Christian nationalism? Looking at the examples of Nazi Germany, and then understanding whether we should accept or deny this. But first, I want to play this clip. You've probably all seen portions of this from MSNBC where it talks about what they deem Christian nationalists is. And so before I play this, I want to lay this groundwork really simply is depending on who you talk to, the term Christian nationalism means something different. There are those who are within conservative Christian circles who say, well, I could be it, but it depends on who's asking. And Randy and I were discussing before is it's ultimately a dog whistle, and it's not something that we should accept in any partiality whatsoever. And we'll get into that here, and that's what our discussion will be about. So I want to bring this clip up and let's listen to it in its entirety because we have to understand who's bringing this term forward and then how easily we have as Christians accepted this because of some very few things. So I'm going to play this.
Right? Remember when Trump ran in
Let me switch this around. All right, here we go.
Right? Remember when Trump ran in 2016, a lot of the mainline evangelicals wanted nothing to do with the divorced, real estate mogul who had cheated on his wife and with a porn star and all of that, right? So what happened was he was surrounded by this more extremist element. You're going to hear words like Christian nationalism, like the new apostolic reformation. These are groups that you should get very schooled on because they have a lot of power in Trump's circle. And the one thing that unites all of them, because there's many different groups orbiting Trump, but the thing that unites them as Christian nationalists, not Christians, by the way, because Christian nationalists is very different, is that they believe.
I want to pause it there because see what she's trying to do there. And I'll bring you in here, Randy, if you have anything you want to interject, is see how she's trying to split it. She's trying to split Christian versus Christian nationalists. And we'll discuss this later, but I want to finish the rest of this clip.
Believe that our rights as Americans, as all human beings, don't come from any earthly authority. They don't come from Congress. They don't come from the Supreme Court. They come from God. The problem with that is that they are determining men, are determining what God is telling them. And in the past, that so-called natural law is, it's a pillar of Catholicism. Catholicism, for instance, it's been used for good in social justice campaigns. Right. Martin Luther King evoked it in talking about civil rights. But now you have an extremist element of conservative Christians who say that.
And there it is. She just pointed out conservative Christians. Obviously, she's the elements of conservative Christianity who want to use this term to dog whistle, to push an agenda. And before I go through the definition here, Randy, is there anything you want to say to kind of comment and build off of what she said there?
This is an excellent example of how you fill your speech with loaded terms. Now Christian nationalism is now a loaded term. And you notice how she said that she described Trump and all of the negatives that she could find. She probably had to look up a list of things to talk about President Trump, where if it had been anyone else, she would have just said President Trump and gone in that he's tied in with Christian nationalism. People need to remember that are with us today. Remember her opening comments, because we're going to go through this with some information and what happened in Nazi Germany and where Christian nationalism is today. But that is the left. That's the far left. That's a textbook example. They need to have that in their far left textbook on how to totally distort an argument.
Yeah. All right. So with that, we see where the left's coming at. And the reason I wanted to play that is because a lot of the people on conservative right, Christians themselves, will, because of what she says, if you remember the fallout of these comments, is a lot of people said, well, yeah, of course, we believe that our rights come from God. We believe in it, and it's in our Declaration of Independence. I literally have it here. Because when she says that, and it says there how in the opening paragraph, of how when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separation and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. And so she forgets, she says one portion of it, but she forgets that literal next phrase, where this gets
Sure.
into Romans 13:1 of the natural order of laws, where it's God and then man's laws. And we obviously we play that out through COVID of what that really means and where people lie on that. And so now I want to get into taking a step back of where we're at, of how does this involve us as Christians. And for anybody who's been following us on Wednesday nights, I want to pull this portion up. If you don't know, on Wednesday nights we've been talking about this heavy topic of the ministry, understanding the ministry of reconciliation. And this comes from the portion in scripture in 2 Corinthians 5, really the whole thing, but the end of it in 14 till the end of the chapter, where it talks about how we've been reconciled through Christ in order so that we can have the ministry of reconciliation to reconcile others back to Christ as ambassadors for Christ. This is where this scripture and this term comes from. And the reason I want to say this is because this is what we have to understand. And this all obviously goes back to the garden and understanding. And Pastor Tim talked about it last week, and he says it every week when he starts it. This teaching is based upon a dream where God showed him we need to clean this up, under this understanding as a body of Christ, because if we don't understand our heart issues, number one, then we can then therefore not reconcile those who God has sent us in to reconcile and be the true ambassadors for Christ. And so if you want to catch the full teaching there, it's on our website, it's on our YouTube channel, Facebook as well, but the best place to find them on YouTube and our website app, anything that's has our media, in the series titled Understanding the Ministry of Reconciliation, where we go through, Pastor Tim goes through the scriptural understanding, and understanding where someone is truly trying to reconcile someone versus manipulation and divination that we want to stay away from there in and of itself. Okay. With that, I want to now build on this term and define this term, Christian nationalism. So Randy and I have been talking about it, and the one we're going to work off of is by a professor at Georgetown University who spent some time in the White House. His name's Paul Miller, whose focuses on national security and international affairs. And this is a definition that is new, obviously, since this is a newer term, but it's one that both the right and the left accept. And it breaks down into three different parts. And I want to read it first before we dive any further. And so the definition is this. What he says Christian nationalism is, he says, Christian nationalism is the belief that the American nation is defined by Christianity and that the government should take action steps to keep it that way. And so we see here, based on that definition, I'll read it one more time. Christian nationalism is the belief that the American nation is defined by Christianity and that the government should take active steps to keep it that way. So when we read that definition, it breaks down into three parts. The first part being, one, that we are a distinct American nation. Two, that we are defined by Christian cultural norms. And then three, that individual Americans and the U.S. government should work to defend, promote an American Christian cultural heritage and values. Now, the right would say, well, yeah, of course we are. When you go back to our founding, one, we are a nation, which we'll get into that here in a second. Two, we obviously are a nation. This is what the right says. We are a nation of Christian cultural norms, which we would all agree are because we are. And then that we should actively participate and defend and promote those principles that we were built upon. But let's take a step back and look at it from the left's point of view. Is one, they say we're a nation. Yes, okay, we can agree on that. Two, they say we're a nation based on this definition. This is where the disagreement comes in, is because they say we're not a Christian nation founded since our founding. We are a secular nation, which is why you see the whole left's push to discredit the Christian principles and Christian understanding of the founders, whether they themselves were Christian or not. They try to fight back against that. And obviously they weren't perfect. We don't want this sinless perfection from our founders, as neither of us are. And then thirdly, they vehemently do not want, in their eyes, Christian principles to be put in place. Now, you could debate that, whether they actually truly believe that or understand that from the debate of where does law come from, but we're not going to get into that. We want to define this and then move forward. Before I bring you in, Randy, I want to take one more step back and talk about one, what is a nation? And then two, what are states? Because this breeds upon the contradiction of things here. So when you actually look at the very basic definition in the Webster's dictionary of what a nation is, it goes back to the definition in Webster's talks about a community of people composed of one or more nationalities. A nationality is basically a bloodline, and possessing a more or less defined territory and or government. So when somebody talks about a nation and or a nationality, that's what they're rooting on. And for us to be Christians and nationalists is completely oxymoronic, because in order for us to be Christians, we need to uphold Christian moral values, Judeo-Christian moral values specifically. In order for us to be a nation, we have to defend nationalistic identities, which we just on the basic definition of the United States of America are, yes, that term is a nation, but a state is not necessarily based upon a group of people. We're based upon a idea of principles, and that's what we've come together to be around. And when you go to the actual definition in Webster's, it talks about how we are a body of persons constituting a special class in a society, and a politically organized body of people usually occupying a defined territory. When we sit there and we talk about being a politically organized body around a territory, we're seeing how our states, when they were first formed together, were formed around a certain identity, which was of those being Christian. Now, there are some estimates, 9 of the 13 states had within their own charters, their constitutions at the founding, that they were of a certain denomination within Christianity. Obviously, at the federal level, they wanted some separation there because they didn't want one state to rule over the other or one denomination to rule over the other. And a lot of the states also had requirements for people that were going to be within the legislature at the state level, which then meant at the federal level, a requirement for them to have a confession of faith. And so we can agree on the second portion of, yes, we are a Christian nation defined on principles, but even going back to the first point is, are we a nation? Yes, but we're more so a union of states. So I'll bring you in here, Randy. You're obviously a better historian than I am. Kind of discuss that point a little bit, and even go into some of the nuances of what you've been able to find and know throughout history of this idea of, nationalism in an American sense, how we're gathered together based upon principles.
See, I think this is the difference. The lady that you played the video to start with, the difference between her and the people that have taken the term Christian nationalism, which you say which you're right, it's a new term. I couldn't find anywhere that in Nazi Germany that term was used. But the definition that I found on Christian nationalism, if you accept that term, is simply that God has called the nations to serve his purpose. And that's where so many times we've talked about, or I like to talk about, that America and Israel are the lights of the world. And if we are nations and we don't serve, then we're no longer going to be a light in the world. The difference between, let me, and I'm going to use notes here a lot, Zach. So I got some great quotes from Churchill and Roosevelt during World War II when we get into that, especially Churchill. But I made a note here that I tried to think about what's the difference between the people that take Christian nationalism and view it as, okay, that's a term, but our purpose has to be more than just that term. It is to serve the purpose of God and be a light to the world. Imagine how dark the world would be if there was not an America. That's what they're trying to do. Later on, we'll go into what you and I talked about a while ago. They kidnapped the Christian nationalism, almost like they were going to take it and shift it to the far left and make us all look like really boogeymen if we even look at the term. But what they've done is See, when they no longer fear God, they have no fear of God in them. They don't fear, they have no trembling fear of our God. And once they do that, they transgress all of his laws without hesitation. And we're going to see that the way they paint us, some examples they use. The fear of the consequences is no deterrent when the fear of God is gone. And there are people, I believe, that say that they are Christians and they don't have that fear of God. And that's how we have allowed the things that we know scripturally are being changed on us every day in our private lives. And so to me, that's where the conflict comes in. And later on, if we have time, I'll read some quotes from Churchill during World War II when it was truly a fight of good versus evil. That was the difference that he felt like. And there was a moral standard there that was being taken out of the nation. But historically, a few minutes on this that I have, America in the 1930s, there was the Depression, there was poverty, there was a lot of hardness. The far left or darkness takes advantage when there's a vacuum there. And in America in the 30s with the Dust Bowl and the Depression and all of this, there was a vacuum there. And socialism, National Socialism, which is what the Nazis were, actually grew very powerful in the United States in the 1930s. There was a National Socialist presidential candidate, Warren Debs, carried several parishes in North Louisiana. People were searching for something, so they tend to get lost into that quagmire of politics. 1930s England was the same way. England was bankrupt from the World War I. They were bankrupt in blood and money. And so people, even the upper class, were looking for something else. We were turning away from God and we were looking for solutions in the natural. And so what happened is that in both countries, in America, in February of 1939, there was a meeting of National Socialist, pro-Hitler, anti-Semitism that would compare to what we see on the streets today, because we didn't have that trembling fear of God. People were suffering and they were looking somewhere besides the laws of God. Now, Germany, being a nationalist in 1930s Germany may not have been a bad thing to look at loosely, because Germany had been horribly mistreated in the war, the Versailles Treaty that ended World War I. They were totally mistreated. It created economic poverty. It really said, hey, you had to have a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread. That's how bad. Our inflation doesn't look anything that bad right now, even though it's bad enough. That's two examples of when people look somewhere else, it creates a vacuum, and that gives darkness a chance to come in. Hitler realized the power of the church. We're talking about the church here. The power of the German church, the power of the Church of England. He realized that. He realized he had to destroy the church and change it to his way to take over what he did. I'll just give you an example here.
Go ahead.
When he took over 1933, when he finally took over the German church, and how did he do it? People didn't have that trembling fear of God. They allowed things to be changed. That's why Bonhoeffer came back from safety. He's safely in America. He comes back to Nazi Germany to fight this and ended up giving his life, Zach. But he understood what had to happen for Hitler to get his purpose. And so Hitler took over. The Nazi youth movement wasn't created. It was simply the German church. The church youth movement moved over to the Hitler youth movement. That's an amazing thought to me when I finally read that. But he went so far, he changed the Lord's Prayer, where it starts out, Adolf Hitler, you are our great leader. Thy name makes the enemy tremble. He changed the Lord's Prayer away from the Christian value. School children. Now, in the 1960s, when I grew up, 50s and 60s, every morning we started a day of school over the intercom, Pledge of Allegiance, and the prayer. This is what the German children were reciting after Hitler came to power. They recited this every day. As Jesus freed men from sin and hell, so Hitler freed the German people from destruction.
Hmm.
Jesus and Hitler were persecuted, but while Jesus was crucified, Hitler was raised to the chancellorship. So you're talking about her twisting words. Well, what did they just do here? They gave Hitler was raised. He was the one that was resurrected in this comment that the German children had to speak every day. Jesus strode from heaven. Hitler was for the German earth. So my point is there, we're going to head into this a little later. But when we give up that Christian value, then this is the vacuum that creates, and that's where people like Hitler and other people take over the far lefts of the world. They aren't here to make America a better place, Zach, at all. And of course, like we talked about off the air before we came on, we were given a real simple subject to talk about. I mean, Christian nationalism, we could talk about this 4 days, but it's been kidnapped and it's been used for bad now. So,
Yeah, that's a great point. Especially bringing up Hitler versus Jesus, is we have to ask this ultimate question comes down to is, are we being discipled by Jesus or by man? And the kind of coming together of the term Christian nationalist from the left is ultimately, and you're seeing this, you've seen this before this term became popular, is because they're skipping over this definition, like she was trying to do there, of saying, conservative Christians, they're Nazis, white supremacy. And this is the reason why I personally am against this term vehemently, is because if you're going to seek the welfare of the nation, you're not called to adopt the principles of that nation that therefore they are ruled by. Look at Daniel. Look at his three friends who were put in the fire. They were in a nation. They were exiles, and in Jeremiah 29, they are told to seek the welfare of the nation. They're told to seek families, build houses, etc., stuff like that. But they're never told to adopt the gods of the nation that they're then sent to. And so, as Christians, the prescription is patriotism, which is that found in Jeremiah 29. And even those who consider themselves liberal Christians would accept. And the problem they come down to is that third portion of trying to defend and cultivate and push forward, because they don't want to see what is called a patriarchy, or even what we know best as a monarchy within England and in Russia, and what was then at the time, even before Hitler came to power in Germany with the Reichs, based upon families, which then gets into, okay, so you have your Christian identity over here, where you're called to put no other gods before you, the whole 10 Commandments, the whole law, even under grace in both old and new. And then you have your nationalism, which what were they trying to push forward? They were trying to push forward the Aryan race. That was what their identity was based upon in their National Socialist identity. And so when you kind of can't combine those together, because the magnets don't work, because they push each other in the opposite direction. And so what we want to get into now is really understanding, okay, you brought up good points, is there was a vacuum because of the dire straits that they were in of the economy within Germany coming out of World War One. And you're right, because in talking about the church, they were able to fill it because he was the one giving the German people jobs through the socialist arm of the government. And not only, and there are many books written about this, not only did he give jobs and everything, and pastors, we got to go with this. There's a state church within Germany, which is why we're set up the way we are here in America, is to understand that, look, and this is where Christian nationalism comes into today, is because the idea that the left is trying to push is trying to go backwards and say, those who want to go back to our founding, what they deem as our founding, speaking from the left's point of view, they want these principles, but these principles lead to monarchy. These principles lead to jailing someone because of their sins. These principles lead to, that's what they think it means. And we have to understand this. They're right. That's why we can't accept this term of being labeled a Christian nationalist. We can be patriots, and understanding the difference there between a nation, a nationalist versus a patriot, and understanding that Hitler, like Randy just said, came in, used the church's children's systems, but then he came in and he convinced the pastors. And this is where, if you've ever heard the name Martin E. Mueller comes in. At first, he agreed with it. Oh yeah, it's fine, no problem. He could turn the nation around, worried about their own pocketbook. But then it came to a point where it's, okay, First they came for the Jews, then they came, and then eventually they came. I'm paraphrasing. They eventually came for the Christians. So what are you going to do? Because now they've made a god and they've allowed him to come in, Hitler to come in and bring his party and his the rules that he had, which were contradictory to Christian ethics, if you want to put it that way. And so let's talk about here now, Randy, go into the depths of it, of what are some examples that where we know those within the church, because we want to speak specifically to the church. We can't worry about those outside the church right now on this subject. Um, we have to understand what this means and what the fruits of it are. And the link between Germany and the term Christian nationalism is the fact that Hitler was able to use the church via its nationalistic identity because it was a state-run church. So that's where the link of, and that's what the left wants to try to tie those who are Christians who disagree with them on how to rule and govern a society. Is they want to say, okay, if you're trying to implement Christian values, you're a Christian nationalist, which then therefore, because you're a nationalist, we can tie you to um, Nazi Germany, and then that's where they get the Nazi Germany. That's why they jump to that so fast. Is you're a Christian? Oh, you're a Nazi, because then it becomes about race. Oh, if you're a Christian nationalist and you're a Nazi, you must be a white supremacist, and therefore you start to see the tide rolling on this. And because people don't understand history and aren't willing to look back on it, that's where we get this tie. So let's walk through looking at some of the economic things of how dire was it, say in Germany, coming out of World War I, beginning that led up to the church and the German people accepting Hitler and his rule and ignoring some of the things that he was saying.
Well, first of all, there was a worldwide depression. The 1929 depression didn't just affect America; it was a worldwide depression. And then when the Versailles Treaty, which was, Germany was not treated fairly in the Paris 1919 treaty. I read a book on it by historian Margaret Macmillan, and even though she disagreed that it set up the stage for World War II, which most people believe, and I do, I believe it also, that she talked about it was set up so that Germany would be in a position for a person like Hitler to take over. And you made a point there, I forgot what the word you used is, but for Hitler to take it, you were right on that. The German people had to literally give their church away. They had to, when they began to fly the National Socialists, the Nazi flags in churches, and then the Nazi salute. It was a small thing. They were very smart in what they did. They did it a bite at a time. First, they put the flags up. Then they put then they did the Nazi salute. But what's important is, which reflects when we get into today, is then they started putting their people in powers of position in the German church. And it was game, set, and match. It was in game. Anything was possible after that. But it all went to me, it all went to the situation that the German people found themselves in. Men that can't find a job, men that can't support their families, men that don't have money to buy food, they become very desperate in that situation. And that's what happened in 30s America to a point. That's how the Hitler movement started in America. It amazed me that 20,000 people met in Madison Square Garden and had on swastikas, and they looked like brown shirts, and they were Americans that were there. In Germany was much the same way. But now to go off just a little bit, I like the term Christian civilization more than Christian nationalism. That was a term that Winston Churchill used. And if anybody wants to learn, I just read a book not a month ago that probably prepared me to talk with you this. It was called God in Churchill. And it was his great grandson, who lives in Dallas, wrote this book at how Churchill was not a churchgoer. You probably never see a picture of him in church a lot. You see him on the Prince of Wales singing hymnals with President Roosevelt a year before the war. But a lot of his speeches were based on scripture, and a lot of his thoughts and a lot of his, especially speeches in the House of Commons, referred to Moses receiving the laws, the Hebrew tribes, and he used the term over and over, Christian civilization. See, to me, and this is just my point of view. The word nationalism is a catchword that can be spun off in several different directions, which is what is exactly happening in our country now with these ladies we saw. Now, can I do this example of my MSNBC? This is Joy Reid. Is that her name?
Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. This is what they've done. Now, the argument that Christian nationalism could mean kind of a one religion type situation. That's I guess that's fair in looking at it. But here's what they've made us. Now, remember what my definition of Christian nationalism is: simply that God has called the nations to serve His purpose, and I think that's what's lifted America up all these years. The freedom that we give people. We are the greatest country. And if you're arguing with a woke teenager or just ask them one trick question: is America a great nation? They can't say yes if they're really into that far left situation. But now here's what Joy Reid, this sounds so much like us. I think everybody will agree this is what Christians are for. Shooting immigrants at the border, full immunity for police to kill at will, terminating the Constitution, bombing Mexico, and stripping women of all their personal rights. That's what she explained Christians being who are Christian nationalists. That's not far off. That's just totally out of bounds. And then also they tie in the anti-Semitism. They try to make Christian nationalism anti-Semitism, which it's actually I just wonder how many people in the far left making that argument would condemn the Biden administration on how they're treating Israel, or would they condemn the October 7th massacres? A lot of them don't even recognize that there was a massacre on October 7th. So they're playing a dangerous game, and I do believe the term kind of opened up allowed them to do that.
Yeah, let's look at her understanding. There is, if you tie that to Nazi Germany, weren't
Yep.
Her claim on Christians now, and American Christians, weren't those some of the same things that the Germans did to the surrounding nations?
Absolutely. That's how they can create fear that people that don't understand. People watching our right now, our show right now, they probably have a background on what Nazism and Hitler did, and they probably have and I'm sure they have a background on our Christian heritage that we live by, the moral standards that we have. Let me give you that's a good quote. That's a good thing you brought up. Let me give you excuse me for a second. I just love these quotes I got in this book that I read the other day.
Go ahead. I like that. I like that term that Churchill used, Christian civilization, because you could look at England in itself. You could look at even currently today, the nation of, we'll just take one example, the nation of Zambia, who talks about in their preamble to their constitution how they are a nation under the Almighty God. So we're not here to say, we're not here to say that, oh, we can't be a nation that is ruled, even as our Declaration of Independence, by laws given to us by our Creator. That's not what we're here against. And this is why those on the right are so easy to accept this term Christian nationalism. And that's where we have to be very careful. And that's why I say we can't accept this term at all, because even though there are those who claim to take the term Christian nationalism, and they are very anti-Semitic. So Joy Reid is right in saying, well, that's what that leads to. She is right, because when she looks at, again, Christian nationalism, Nazi Germany, or Germany, Nazis, the nationalist identity, that's where they tie that in. But we want to, again, Romans 13, put God above man's laws there. But go ahead with your quote.
Well, that's a common thread that she did. And think about this. Think about those people that watched that show and she made that comparison. If they don't have a background, if they don't have a background to understand the truth, then they make that connection also. That description she just gave that I read is a common link between Nazi Germany and Christians, is what she was trying to do. And it probably worked in some cases. But now Churchill, let's get to Churchill for a minute. A couple of things here. And the reason I did this, Zach, when I saw what we were talking about, I really made a connection between, World War II was actually a good versus evil. I think that's why it's so popular still today. It was It was defined. It was clear. Good versus evil. It was a fight for that to save the world. Churchill, in a speech, said that it was to protect the Christian civilization from world anarchy. See, put Christian nationalism term aside for a second. This is what you and I are talking about, and the people are listening to. It is Christian civilization versus world anarchy. That's where the battle is right now. But see, those terms can't be kidnapped. Those terms can't be moved across the checkerboard. They have to use a term like nationalism. But now Churchill, a couple of things. In 1949, this is actually after the war. The flame of Christian ethics is still our highest guide. Now, he was very eloquent with his words. The flame of Christian ethics is still our highest guide. To guard and cherish, it is our first interest, spiritually and materially. He spoke about the laws on Mount Sinai in the House of Commons. And here Moses received from Jehovah the tables of those fundamental laws, which we henceforth to be followed, with occasional lapses, but by the highest forms of human society. And what Churchill's telling us there, without that, without those principles that we've studied in the Bible, the scriptures, then we become a world of anarchy. The Hebrew tribes, the Hebrew tribes wandering in the wilderness grasped and proclaimed an idea of which all the genius and power of Rome were incapable. That tells you how much value he put into this Christian civilization with its moral standards. That's something that MSNBC cannot skew and delineate from. And then President Roosevelt also, he spoke in a fireside chat, which he always spoke to the American people. He was a great communicator. This is a monumental battle between good and evil, civilization and savagery, that would be inevitably toward victory. Powerful, this is the 2 days after Pearl Harbor. Powerful and resourceful gangsters have banded together to make war upon the whole human race. Those are concepts and those are quotes that we can apply to what's happening to us and our nation today. Don't you think? I mean,
Absolutely, yeah.
It's clear cut that way. We can take out the Christian nationalism term and then use something that we can really grasp and put ourselves to.
Yeah, I like that. And I think now let's kind of flip the script here. So we see how Hitler was able to use the vacuum, in your terms. I like that, of the church and the desperation of the German people to put food on their table, and you can't blame them necessarily for that. But it's where they to some degree turned a blind eye when they should have known not to do the things that they did based upon Christian principles. And we don't mean to say this to bash the German people. We want to say this is we want to learn from their mistakes. We want to learn, hey, we're headed right down that same road. Like, look at our economy, look at the values of this nation, of where we're headed, of each state, if you want to put it that, of the union of our states. But now let's flip the script of the national identity is, and this goes back centuries, of the German people, of holding on to, and this is where the blinders came in, of Hitler was able to use their tie to German identity, and that's why a lot of, because of how they came out, and I agree with you, because of how they came out of World War One, they wanted to right the wrong that was done to them in and of an extent. And maybe you have some more in-depth understanding of this than I do, so I'll let you talk on this point. Is how was we see how the church was able to be used, but how was that national identity that he was able to, in and of an extent, rather than reconcile it back to God, he diverted it and through divination to get his worldview of upholding the Aryan race. How that national view was able to then, with the Christian view, to be tied into to turn the nation against the other nations who had wronged them coming out of World War One into World War Two.
Oh, absolutely. He and his people were a genius at doing that. He isolated Germany into a nation and over and over again talked about how they were mistreated, why they were here was not their fault, that it was the fault of the war. And he even had the German people convinced the Germany really didn't lose the the Great War. But he took that nationalism and turned it into a weapon instead of building it with maybe you could take the term of nationalism and you could use it toward good probably in that situation, but that was not his purpose, and he used it nationalism to create that vacuum. Blame the Jews, blame the world. It's us against the world. He was great at doing that, but keep in mind, if one man in a powerful position had stood up, Hitler would have never come to power.
Mm-hmm.
If when he went into Sudetenland, if England and France had stood up and said, no, that's against, you're not supposed to do this, you're going to back out or we're coming in. And nobody did anything. So people have to become totally disconnected. They have to become apathetic, appeasing for these totalitarian governments, or for a country like America to change in the way they want to change America into a place that you don't want your children raised in, and I don't want grandchildren or great grandchildren raised in. And that's the fact that we have to be totally out of character with it, don't want to connect with it. And I think that at some point, because you made a point a while ago, he built the Autobahn, he created jobs, he made the trains run on time. I think that kind of put the German people to sleep, if you will, for him to come in and do his power. But he did use nationalism that could have been used for good. He used it for bad.
Yeah. Let's take a step back here. And because I want to tie this, because we have to understand this link. And Dr. Michael Brown talks about this in his book, Our Hands Are Stained in Blood, is Kristallnacht, which kind of kicked off the Holocaust, was based around a book that Martin Luther wrote years before, obviously, called "The Jews and Their Lies." And this is the issue with Christian nationalism, even here in America, is a lot of them are anti-Semitic because they say Jews are bad, because you have Jews like George Soros and Jews like Charles Schwab and other Jews who do bad things. And they say, well, all Jews are like that. They're greedy, blah, blah, blah. They're over the banking system. But that's only a section of Jews. There's a flip side of there are good Jews who don't do any of that, who live in utter poverty. You look at other Jews around the world who, even in Iran, who are persecuted, and other nations who have been persecuted throughout the years. And so this is where, if we allow ourselves to be tied to an identity outside of Christ and an identity in man, we can be perverted, like you're talking about, to do what. And there are issues with Martin Luther, but because of Luther's doctrine and his understanding of his anti-Semitism towards the Jews, it came in through, unfortunately, the Lutheran Church. And that's where we have to be very careful of understanding this, and why we want to outright, utterly reject this term Christian nationalism, because it is used solely by the left. They created it, they've termed it, they've defined it, and all they're doing, we didn't talk about all of this at front, but Randy pointed to the fact that, look, Joy Reid's comments, they're basing it off of, and they're correct to base it off of, Nazi Germany, because it was a bad example of a Christian nation being infused with its nationalism to be overtaken and have an idol of its nationalism. And look, we all have our heritages, nationalistically, mine being Scottish Irish, others, I know of other family. My wife is Hispanic. It goes back, everybody has their own identity. There's nothing wrong in that. And I think that's where the nation in of itself, the heritage from the family, specifically comes into. But we can't put that above God and our identity, because, and maybe you can speak to this more, of how, when we look at an example of it being perverted and an identity of being discipled by a man, of the things that you can do, which leads us into the Holocaust.
Oh, yeah. Who would have thought? I mean, this is the thing that amazed me when I wrote the other book, the second book. How do you take a 18-year-old German soldier and convince him that it's right to go and and murder a woman and child, I mean, you're looking at them. You're 5 feet from them when you shoot them. It's not like you're throwing bombs from 10,000 feet. How do you convert them? You do it like Hitler said. If I can give me a child 6 years old, I'll make anything out of him. And that was why the Hitler Youth Movement came to be. And what do we have now? One of the first things I learned when I came to Christian Center Shreveport was a class taught by Tom Dalton about the 7 mountains. And look what children are being taught in our schools now. Look what they are being forced to read, the books they're being forced to read. Our kids at 6 years old are being taught a different background. They're going to, and unless their parents or unless they are put in another school, then the foundation they have is not one that we consider they would be having in America in a public school system. And that's the catch. If you'd have tried to take a soldier at 18 and convince him of it, he probably wouldn't have done it. And a lot of them couldn't do it. If you take him at 6 and teach him that the Jews were bad, the Jews weren't really human, and teach them all of that, which is why this lady on MSNBC probably makes that comparison. She probably doesn't have the foundation or the knowledge to understand that common thread that she was trying to build is not realistic. It's historic. It's historic, like you say, but it's not realistic in the world today if you're comparing Christians to doing what she listed there under Christian nationalism.
Yeah, and let's go back to what you stated from the very beginning of look at what they're trying to do. They're trying to make our nation here in America, make our nation turn it into a secular nation where we go with societal norms, which is why you see the term a democracy making its rise rather than somebody put it in the comments here on Rumble. It's like, look, we're a constitutional republic. And what were the famous words? You have your constitution and a moral people can uphold it. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, if you choose to keep it. And that used to be the norm of we were a Christian nation. There is the 1892 Supreme Court case, I think Holy Trinity versus the United States, where the ruling Supreme Court justice talked about, he said, we are a Christian nation ruled by Christian morals. And there have been others. John Jay says it as well. Later in the Supreme Court, presidents, I mean, on and on and on. If you follow Bill Federer, he points this out, a great modern historian who goes through the litany of quotes. And even some of the simple ones you've given here today, Randy, are great reminders, even Churchill, that not only are we, I like the term Christian civilization, but the term patriot applies as well. Because you can see Daniel doing that as in his exodus and his exile there, as he's told in Jeremiah, to seek the welfare of the nation that you're in. Because this goes back to, which would lead into patriotism of, look, Acts 17:26 talks about how God has appointed man to live in certain times and seasons and in boundaries of the nations. And so when we see that is, okay, we can, and this is where we as believers have to understand is, look, we can seek the welfare of the nations. And I think you gave great examples. If you were talking to, a woke teenager at the dinner table, and if you're saying if you ask them a question, do they think America is great? That's ultimately a destruction. That goes against the commands of what the Lord would hope for us to do in the nation that he has placed us, which is to seek the welfare of the nation, which, whether you're a conservative Christian or a liberal Christian, you can get behind. And hopefully the point of what we get to in this conversation is looking at the fruits, because we're winding down here, looking at the fruits of what we've seen in one example of a perverted nationalist Christian identity, that those same people who would adhere and accept Christian nationalism believe some of the same things the Nazis. So when you hear these correlations between what Joy Reid says of Christian nationalism and Nazi Germany, they're right to make those assertions. We have to be intellectually honest, but understand we have to outright reject that, because those pushing for the Christian nationalist identity they want exactly what Nazi Germany was. They want a supreme leader like Iran to rule based upon what they deem is right and the rules that they deem are right, not based upon scripture, but based upon what they deem and how they interpret
Yeah.
scripture. And that's where we have to delineate from. So a few closing remarks, Randy, and then I'll close it out here.
Okay, this is a quote from Somerset Maugham. He was a British writer in the 30s in England. He saw what was happening to the British people and the British politicians like Lord Halifax that wanted to sign a peace treaty with Hitler. I can't imagine that now, but the price of freedom. He wrote this article. If a nation values anything more than freedom, it will lose its freedom. And the irony of it is the things that are more important than freedom, comfort or money, and I put in insert present day entertainment, it values more, it will lose them also. In other words, he was making a comment. If you put everything else aside and you don't value freedom, all those things that you think are as important or more important than freedom, you will lose everything. Last thought, this is very timely. If I've got a second, Harrison Butker he was the Kansas City chief kicker.
Yeah.
I read the transcript. 15 years ago, that would have been a on board everybody Christian message. It's a good message. He spoke. Look at the people that condemn that. Look at the people that he's under brutal attack, and he's a Christian that gave a good piece sound of advice to this graduating. That's the work. That's what we've allowed our nation to become to this point.
Yep. That's great points, Randy. All right, I'll talk to you on that backside. All right, so with that, I want to close and kind of go through again the last points that we have here of what we started out with. We wanted to define what Christian nationalism is. If you've watched this or you're catching us now, go back to the very beginning. We pointed out, we gave the definition and a few definitions of what we are. And then we want to look at the fruits of Nazi Germany and how the National Socialists within Germany were able to use Christianity and the nationalism and their ties to push forward that Third Reich, and how the left is using those ties between Christianity here in America and nationalism and the link to that to Nazi Germany, which is why they jump from Christians are nationalists, because they see it as, this is their lens, they see Christians as Christian nationalists, which means if they're Christian nationalists, then that means they must be like Nazi Germany. And then, oh, well, Christians are Nazis. So that's the full circle that they run through there in their mind. And through their lens, they're not wrong, because the term Christian and nationalist cannot coexist together. And the reason we are pointing this out is because there are Christian leaders, conservative and liberal, non-exist, who accept this. There are some who don't accept this. But for those of us in the charismatic movement, we have to outright reject this. And there are those within the charismatic movement, you probably know who I'm talking about, who accept this term. And we have to vehemently stand against this and consider and start considering ourselves through the lens of what Randy talked about, Christian civilization, or better, and even equal to that, I should say, is patriot. And we'll get into that here in the next couple weeks with me moving and everything. I want to do a semi-documentary like explanation of this and further of what we should be doing of the term being a patriot, because it's built upon that seeking the welfare of the nation. And so the reason we have to push back against this is because we can't easily accept a term, one, that we don't understand, but then two, that goes against and can be easily influenced towards deception, towards walking away from Christ. And going back to the foundation scripture that we're holding this on, and the reason we're having this conversation is in Second Corinthians, 5, and you could look at the end of the chapter, but you could start at 14 on towards the end, where it talks about the ministry of reconciliation. And the question is are we reconciling people back to Christ? Are we reconciling people back to man? And that's the difference. And that's in the definition of, are we a Christian nation? Yes. Do we have Christian values that we identify since the founding of our nation? Yes. That the left tends to say, no, we're secular, which we disagree on. And then 3, that obviously the left, those who are secularists, and even some Christians would want to allow secular policies and laws to come forward, whereas we say no, we want to uphold Christian moral values within a Judeo-Christian civilization that we want to uphold. And so hopefully this can give you a grasp of a very in-depth subject. And when you hear this term, push back, because a lot of times if you ask the question of, well, what do you mean by Christian nationalists? One, either they don't know or they're just repeating something they've heard online. And then two is understand this is where you can build a bridge with those who don't like that term. You can say, yes, I agree with you. And then you can start to find some commonality and let that be your way to reconciliation with them and leading them back to Christ. Yes, I don't agree with that term Christian nationalism, because what they're looking for is they're trying to tie Christianity to Nazis. And so we want to break that bridge there and bring the term and build the bridge from Christianity to Jesus, because we're called to be imitators of Christ there and be that ambassador for him to reconcile people back to Christ. And so if we understand that very simple definition there of what Christian nationalism is, how to push back, we can therefore start to make headway on not accepting this horrible term that the left is trying to identify Christians who they disagree with, because it's their own brand of Christianity. It's lukewarm Christianity that they're trying to push. And we want to stand up against that and be the hot temperature in a boiling sense of Christianity that stands and is an ambassador for Christ. So thank you all for joining with us today on Noon Prayer. We'll be back tomorrow at Shreveport in our Eastern Auditorium with a time of prayer and worship. And today was meant to focus on this topic so that we can, in our prayer times, seek to understand what the natural is revealing, which is in the spiritual, of this identity, this spirit that is trying to rise up. The gods of the ages trying to rise up in this time, and pray against that. Pray for our leaders within the church, in our governments, who, let's say, because there are some who accept this identity. Let's say they pray that they don't accept this because of what it leads to and what the left thinks it leads to. And then it creates a whole division and it builds a mountain for people to get over in order to accept a healthy, lawful order of government and even leadership within the church. So thank you all for joining with us today. We'll close it out and we'll see you guys back here tomorrow as we continue our prayer and standing for this nation. Blessings, and I'll see you guys later. Have a good one.